Today we're going to talk about something that we've been talking about a lot, we've been thinking about a lot, and I'm sure that if you are here, this is something that you have questions about or are looking at yourself, which is how to run customer success in HubSpot. So what we're going to go through today, who are we and why are we talking about this stuff? Why run CS in your CRM? How to configure HubSpot for customer success? How to run better handoffs from sales to success in HubSpot? It's a question that we get a ton. Handoffs in general, obviously a pain point, but specifically, how do you do that? How do you think about that if you're running both sales and CS in HubSpot? And then finally, how to use product data in HubSpot. This is another big one that we hear. Not something that is talked about a ton, it seems like, in the HubSpot community. Certainly not something that's very native to HubSpot. So if you're comparing running CS in HubSpot against something like a CS platform, that one might be of interest to you. And then, as I mentioned, we'll get into some questions and answers at the end. So if you have anything, drop it in the chat as we go. So really quick, I'm Stuart Balcombe. I run product marketing at Arrows. Spend a whole bunch of time in HubSpot figuring out new use cases specifically for teams that are running onboarding and customer success. And then joined here by Shareil Narriman, who is head of customer success at Arrows and is running customer success in HubSpot. We don't use a separate tool. So this is both things that we're exploring for the folks that we're working with Arrows the product, which is customer-facing onboarding and success plans that attach directly to HubSpot. So we're talking to lots of folks about this topic there, but also Shareil doing this himself. Shareil, maybe a quick, pitch on or a note on the stuff that you've done before and like why CS in HubSpot is sort of interesting to you.
Yeah, generally I've been in the field of onboarding and customer success and those early life cycle stage management, both from building programs, managing teams, scaling those efforts, and really doing it cross-departmentally. And in the last 10 years or so, I've always found the most critical piece of all of that is having that data and those lessons and those insights available to the rest of your departments and the rest of your organization so that you can one, fight for things like budget for your teams when it comes time for headcount, but also give visibility, give real context to that voice of customer that we talk so much about. And I think that's best captured somewhere where everyone in your organization has access to it. So I always find myself either buying new tools and figuring out how to get that data back into the CRM, or just figuring out a process or a way to start there and then enrich that data with the other tools I use. So super excited about this topic and excited to chat about it.
Yeah, for sure. And not to, we could hop on this. It was kind of unplanned, but the connected customer was a theme and a major topic at Inbound. And like I said, it's something that has always been important to have every interaction that you're having with a customer, everything that goes into having that interaction with the customer be connected and in one place and accessible. But I think now more than ever, customers' expectations of the experience have never been higher, and being able to actually deliver that and operationalize that has become incredibly important. So we kind of touched on it a little bit, but the first thing that we're going to get into is why run CS in your CRM. We're going to talk about HubSpot specifically, but this also applies sort of more broadly if you're not using HubSpot and you're considering whether you're building a CS program, an onboarding program for the first time. And we're going to use those. They're not interchangeable, but we sort of see, onboarding is something that we talk a lot about specifically, which is going to be part of that broader post-sale customer success motion. But if you're not, whatever tooling you're currently using, these sort of points and this framework will sort of be more broadly applicable than just to HubSpot, even though we'll use HubSpot for everything that we're talking about. So the first thing is process. When you're running a customer success program, when you're running a customer success program that you need to scale to support more customers, that you need to support new use cases, that you need to support an ever-expanding product, having a process for running your success motion, it becomes more and more important. And HubSpot or any other CRM, HubSpot specifically here, has pipelines that are designed for moving customers through a defined process. One of the reasons that we like pipelines so much, specifically for onboarding, is that onboarding is a very outcome-driven or an outcome-focused process, right? And the same can be said for renewals or for sales or for pretty much any other process that you're going to work on with a customer. There is an outcome in mind, and having a way to define the process that you're going to use to get the customer from where they are today to that outcome that they want, that's beneficial both for them and for the business, is really important. And pipelines in HubSpot are a great way to do that. Number 2, communication. This is one that this touches on a lot of different things, but the CRM is designed to track customer activity, right? Customer relationship management is sort of the core of a CRM, right? So that in today's world means a lot of different things. There are a lot of different places that customers might be communicating with your business, and having a place where all that activity comes together and is accessible to both the people on your specific success team, the teams within that, or more broadly, stakeholders across the organization can come to get context on what's happening with a customer and understand the journey that customer has been on. It's great, and the CRM and HubSpot specifically is very much designed to do that. Number 3, reporting. This is something that we bump into a lot and sort of really ties to that first point around process. If you don't have defined process, if you don't have a single place where you're pulling everything together, it becomes really difficult to accurately report on what is actually happening. By leveraging that data that's already in HubSpot and then HubSpot's specific reporting functionality, there is a full and pretty powerful reporting suite in HubSpot. You can not only get reporting and get insight into what's happening for your team, but also make that insight and those reports accessible across the organization. Like Shareil mentioned, whenever you need to go and get budget, or you need to make the case for a new hire, or you need to, back up what you're doing with data, having reporting that's accurate and available and that everybody can access is really helpful in doing that. And being able to, one of my favorite features in HubSpot is being able to create a report, create a dashboard, and then automatically send a recurring email on a schedule to the stakeholders who need to access it, which is something that is much more difficult to do if you have to go manually pull data, manually pull together that report that you want to share. Fourthly, automation. This is something that gets talked about a lot in CS when you're running CS that needs to scale, where you're supporting, whether it's more self-serve, lower touch segments of customers, but having a way to automate the repetitive, tedious parts of your workflows is really beneficial. And HubSpot, of course, powers that with workflows. And having automation in place, as we'll see later, doesn't necessarily mean removing the human from the relationship, doesn't necessarily mean removing the human from the loop with the customer, but hopefully enables your team to work on the things that are highest leverage, helps them be more proactive and have the data available that they need to do the things that they are uniquely qualified, uniquely specialized in helping customers to do. And then finally, this has sort of been the thread the whole way through this, but as Shareil mentioned, I'd love to get your take on this as well, Shareil, but having the CRM as a place where you're able to aggregate and bring all of your customer data together in one place as your sort of source of truth is really powerful, because it means you can run, compound reporting, you can run by, combining data from multiple sources. You can make sure that you have the complete picture of the customer journey, so that you're not sort of over-indexing on something because you're only looking at data which is from one source. Things like that. So those are 5 reasons why we think running CS in your CRM is not only makes sense, but has a lot of advantages over going and buying a specific CS tool or trying to integrate, everything that is already in your CRM with another place which is going to create a new silo of data. But having a CRM is that place that every everybody on your team has access, everybody on your team lives, and then also all that data comes together is really powerful. Sure, I know you mentioned, needing to have everything in one place for the case of going and get budget. What are some of the things that what's a horror story or like a thing that you've seen become problematic by not having everything in one place for CS in the CRM?
Yeah, that's a great question. And part of this too is these 5 points are huge topics, right? Like there's so much data, there's so many reports, there's so much automation, and that can all be very overwhelming. You can have 50 pipelines, that can be overwhelming. The key though is to start somewhere. Pick a singular data point, pick a singular report, pick a problem that you're having and figure out if there's a means to measure that internally, and then start there and then build on that. And eventually these 5 buckets will fill up. And to answer your question, things that I've dealt with this most of my career, which is I want to hire more onboarding CSMs because I believe onboarding is valuable. And I believe that turns customers into longer customers that stick around and grows their expansion revenue and prevents them from churning. And it's often viewed as kind of this objective or reactive approach or support type role. And it's hard to get it's hard to get budget for it. And being able to physically show, here was X amount of deals that closed, here is the team that supported them from post-sale into actually becoming a customer, actually doing those things that they set out to solve with your problem or service, and actually answering their questions, and then being able to show on a pipeline, here are Stuart's 5 accounts that he's onboarding, here are Shareil's 3 accounts that he's onboarding, here's how much revenue they're worth because they're associated to a deal or to an initial opportunity that you're working, and then to physically move that dollar amount through that pipeline and get them to a point of being retained, to a point of making that renewal opportunity a non-event a year later. That's all data, and I say to go argue your case, but it should be more of a conversation, right? We're used to arguing our case and defending for those things because we've had to, and often that is because we don't have the data to prove it. So then you're saying things like, but my team is great, and onboarding is great, and my customers feel great after we do it. Now you can physically show 10 of them started here, 10 of them moved through onboarding successfully. If you had a churn problem before at day 60, that's a single data point you can start measuring. Do you still have the same percentage of customers churning before or after implementing this onboarding? Do you have the same percentage of customers renewing or extending those contracts at the 12-month mark once they're in a real customer success motion? Inevitably, is CSAT improving, or is NPS improving, or is that overall customer experience improving? And that can be as simple as a 1-question survey, yes or no, was this a good or bad experience? But are you able to prove all those things that most of us in customer success intrinsically believe, which is if we help our customers out, they are going to be happier and they are going to stick around longer. So now you can actually tie some of that data to it, and I've used it to be able to say, okay, sales team, sales leaders, you're forecasting X amount of growth next year. I need this many reps to support that growth, because now I can pretty confidently tell you that if we get 10 new customers a month, I need 1 person to support them, for example. If we get 20, I need 2. If we need 30, I need 3 to produce same results. That's the key too. If you actually want to grow and scale these processes, you have to start by figuring out, like, what does it take to produce these same exact results? And then how do we improve them, right? So if you want to get into the business of growing customers beyond 100% net revenue retention, what did that journey look like, and how do we repeat that? So in that example, maybe that's one CSM working with 8 customers instead of 10, and they're able to give them each 1 more call. But now you have that actual data, and better yet, you have reports and dashboards that show this whole thing. And one thing that I really, really harp on is, we keep saying data. All of those are just literal moments in that life cycle that now you're documenting inside of a single tool, ideally your CRM. Wherever you're doing it is fine, but ideally your CRM, because now more people have access to it. Like you said, you can use native reports, you can use native dashboards, you can use all those features that are already there and continue to tell your story and fight that fight, if you will.
Yeah, and I think there's something that is sort of mentioned there as well that is really important to remember, is that the customer lifecycle spans multiple teams, right? And that there is always, and we're going to get into this next, but there's always going to be handoffs between teams, which obviously the handoff itself, is a critical moment, is a huge opportunity to improve and not drop the ball, or improve beyond, not just dropping the ball, but actually make those great and see them as a growth opportunity. But beyond that, if sales is doing one thing over here, and not to pick on sales, but if we have one team doing something over here and then another team's doing something else over there, we can't, the biggest wins and the biggest opportunities likely exist in between the two teams, right? Or they exist by changing something that happened before the customer got to us, or something that happened, with this group of customers that didn't happen with that group of customers. And having everything in one place, I know we keep using data to your point, like data, not just quant data, but also the context which comes with a customer record of having everything in one place and accessible, means that you can actually make improvements that are, they're not necessarily incremental things because you can tweak a dial on a dashboard, but you can say like, oh, maybe this process that we had somewhere else in the journey doesn't make sense because we've seen a number of customers who have that experience and now they're having this experience, right?
Yeah.
And I think being able to do time to insight is really important, right? And everybody talks about being close to the customer, but letting everybody access the journey of the customer just gives you more opportunities to improve those things and ultimately have a bigger impact for the customer than if you have to go and figure out if you have to make it a multi-week project to go figure out how are we going to get data about X so that we can answer this question.
So yeah, let's get into some of that how. Jeremy's asking in the chat as well. Like, I think the why is becoming more evident to people. How do you actually go do this thing now?
Yeah, for sure. And this, I'm going to go relatively quickly through this fixed step because there are a bunch of different ways that you could set it up. If you have specific questions, if you drop them in the chat, we can get into them. We also have a lot of videos, a lot of content that already covers specific parts of this. So how to configure HubSpot for running customer success. So sort of three big questions to talk about initially. Which hubs should you use? There's two. There's one that probably a lot of teams that are already using HubSpot are very familiar with, which would be Sales Hub, and maybe the marketing team is using HubSpot as well. And then there's Service Hub and then Operations Hub. Typically the toss-up for, not say the toss-up, but the big decision will come down to, are you going to use Sales Hub or Service Hub for running success? There are some benefits, pros and cons to both, and ultimately what that's going to look like is, are you using a deal pipeline? We mentioned at the very top, pipelines are a great way to run an outcome-focused process. So are you using deal pipelines, which are going to have sort of better revenue reporting? They sort of sit, I guess, closest to the company record, and then you can then associate tickets with them, for example, or are you going to use Service Hub and use a ticket pipeline, which has some nice features like SLAs and better or more out-of-the-box time to close, and also allows you to associate the individual ticket which you're using for, whether it's for onboarding, whether it's for success, with the original deal, so you can still get some revenue reporting that way. Second big question, which HubSpot tier will you need? You can absolutely run success in HubSpot on any of the paid tiers. The big question, to me at least, the sort of two breaking points, I think, that would cause or make me think that the next step up would be most important. The first one is going from starter to pro, which automation is really the big jump to me in that decision. Are you going to want to run automated workflows, which there are a lot of great reasons to make that argument, especially once you get beyond running success with a few customers, a few tens of customers. Having some automations in there is definitely going to make life a lot easier. And there's also some custom reporting that sort of sits on the pro side of that line too. And then we're not going to talk a whole lot about enterprise today, but custom objects is a big reason to go beyond pro to enterprise. But again, I think a lot of that decision which tier at least for what we're going to talk about today, the bigger jump will be between Starter and Pro for the automation and the custom reporting pieces there. So which objects and properties should you configure? The objects that you're configuring, the first thing there will be sort of determined by which hubs you're using. So if you're using Sales Hub, you're going to be configuring deals. If you're using Service Hub, you're going to be configuring tickets. And a few things to keep in mind as you're looking at the properties that you are going to need for success, which may be different than what you already have. So one sort of big thing is, are there things that apply to this customer, whichever stage of their life cycle they are in? So properties there might be like their sort of account level properties, right? So how many team members do they have associated with their, what products, what are their account level product usage metrics, like those kinds of things. You're going to want to see what is their life cycle, what is their total spend on an account. Those kinds of things you'll most likely want to put on a company record, and then you can copy those properties to whether it's deals or tickets that are going to be associated with that company. And then individual properties to think about for customer success are going to be things like desired outcomes, health scores, things like next steps. If you're in an onboarding process, for example, like what is the next thing that you need to do? What is the next thing that they need to do? And then anything that is going to help you identify which customer segment they're in, what is anything that you're going to need for, and we'll talk about this further into the handoff section as well, but anything you're going to need for which customer segment they're in, anything that you're going to need for reporting, for customer success specific reporting, and then any context which you want to have about that customer. So that could be things like persona, use case, I already mentioned, desired outcomes. Things like that are going to be custom properties that you're going to want to add to whichever objects you're configuring. We already mentioned this one, but this will sort of be mentioned throughout because this is sort of a core tenet of how we think about running customer success in HubSpot, is to orient everything that you're working on with customers around a pipeline that is focused on an outcome. The reason for doing that is that the pipeline allows you to define the stages in the journey to that outcome, and then use those stages to drive automations, to drive triggers for communication, to drive reporting, and to visually see that pipelines are a great way to visualize where in the journey to that outcome the customer is. So we recommend creating, like you have a pipeline for sales, also creating a pipeline for onboarding, creating a pipeline for renewals, creating a pipeline for sort of ongoing success, so that you can put the properties that are relevant and display the properties that are relevant to that stage of the life cycle in that pipeline, and then see how our customer is moving through that journey.
And you can use this with deals or tickets. Traditionally, deals are kind of sales oriented, tickets are more support and success type oriented. And depending on your HubSpot instance, if you have custom pipelines and custom objects, you can build that within there too. But that visualization of it is key. Plus, deep within that is data to show you how long customers are actually sitting in certain stages. And that's when you'll know what to optimize or what to tweak, especially if you're starting small.
Okay, anything else to add on HubSpot setup, Shareil? What's something that you, I'm going to put you on the spot here, what is something that you have found that's different today than it was, or than you expected it to be when you first started thinking about setting up success in HubSpot?
What's different is I think more and more people are trying to do it. What is a lot of the same is still a lot of these tools are initially built to be marketing or sales type products, and we're seeing that shift because of demand. And so what's nice to see is I think HubSpot and Salesforce are both prioritizing those things, whether that's building native features and or integrating with other tools that allow you to run success more effectively in there. But I'm seeing more people investing time into it and seeing roles like success ops type roles pop up, or we've seen sales and marketing ops type roles. So having a designated person on top of your engineers and your data teams that are building the infrastructure, but having someone who's kind of like a PM on it, if you will. And I've played that role in the past where I'm a program manager for onboarding or for success, and you get to liaise between these different departments, because you do want to, kind of on this topic of handoffs, you do want it also to be smooth for your internal teams. You don't want to introduce a whole new process that changes the way marketing has worked or sales has worked or support has worked. So it is in tandem with those other departments, and I'm seeing more teams actually prioritize that and work cross-departmentally to build it, which has been awesome.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's get into the sort of two topics, and I'll jump into HubSpot here as well to sort of show how this is set up. So handoffs are, as I mentioned, sort of such a critical point in the customer journey. There's probably multiple of them, or may well be multiple of them in the entire life cycle of a customer. And leaving customers at this point where they've been working with one person and now they're going to be working with somebody else or another department, even if it's the same, another part of the process, even if it is going to be the same process, leaving them guessing just means they push you down their priority list. So we're going to talk about 3 quick ways to win with handoffs and then how to do them in HubSpot. So number 1 is putting guardrails in place. Like, how can you create a process for handoffs that is easy for your team to follow, ensures that everything that needs to happen in a handoff happens, and that it is repeatable and things without things falling through the cracks, both of the current scale and the current sort of number of handoffs that you have, but also as the number of customers, as the number of items that may need to be included in that handoff grows. How do you make sure that you have the appropriate guardrails in place to make sure that those are happening consistently and the customer isn't seeing, anything getting dropped in the process? Number 2 is automation. So if there are manual steps that need to happen, are there any of those that can be automated so that they're sort of taken care of and not left to somebody manually doing them, but also freeing up your team's time to work on the higher leverage items in the handoff for them. And then finally, and this is something that we talk about a ton at Arrows, is how do you provide transparency in the handoff to make sure that customers actually know what is the next thing that they need to do and what is the thing that you're doing. If there isn't an immediate task for them, what are you doing that is meaning that they're not making progress this second? And this is something that we see a lot in the gap between, or the handoff between sales and success. And we'll talk about some strategies for handling that. So, and I'll jump right into HubSpot, but 3 big sort of buckets of things that can be really impactful for improving handoffs in HubSpot are required properties, workflows, and as part of that, assignment of internal tasks, and then templates and customer communication. So I'm going to jump over to HubSpot and we'll take a look at each of those 3 things. Shareil, as I'm sort of getting this set up, anything that you want to mention on the things on the principles side of handoffs, like things to avoid, things to look for if folks are looking to improve their own handoffs?
Yeah, just generally make sure that if you have discovery questions or any type of information you've gathered from customers, make sure that's handed off so that the next team isn't repeating themselves, isn't repeating questions that were already asked, isn't slowing down the momentum that customer is making. We're all human. We're going to have broken processes. We're going to have broken handoffs. We're going to have fields missing in our CRM. The goal is that our customers shouldn't have to feel that pain. So any sort of questions you find yourself asking in that next lifecycle stage, see if that information is already captured ahead of that and turn that into kind of like what you're doing, showing here, some sort of required field. the most common things you want to obviously capture are their goals, who the contact people are, and what it is they're trying to accomplish with your product.
Yeah, that's a great segue into the first thing, which is required fields in, if I back out of this, we're looking at the sales pipeline here, but this could, you could use this in any pipeline, but requiring properties on a record to be complete before moving it, or before it can be moved to a future step in the process, is essentially what required properties allow you to do. Depending on your specific process and your specific requirements in that next stage, sort of determine what you want to require here. And obviously there's a balance, right? The more things that you put in here, it's the point about guardrails, and you need people to adopt this process. If you have too many things in here which are not already being captured or are a lot of effort to capture, then it's less likely that this process will be adopted and that people will just put not very useful responses in here. So sort of treading that line and really talking to the team that is responsible for the previous step can help avoid that. So I'm just going to put in some numbers here. So let's say and the things that, as I mentioned, when you're setting up your properties for success, the things to pay particular attention to here are the things that you're going to need to make a decision in the next step. So this is a good example of that. Does this customer need a migration from an existing solution? Because that's probably going to influence the way that we onboard that customer. Has this customer got budget approval, or have they made an internal decision or in their contract agreed to something which enables them to unlock a new feature set? That might be something that we need to talk about in the onboarding process. So that's step number one, is having required properties at each stage, at each point where you're going to move a customer between stages in the life cycle, to make sure that you have everything that you need in the next. And then that ties pretty directly to workflows. So I'm going to jump into a workflow that we like to set up for the handoff. And the way that this works is there's actually two workflows here. One of which, when that deal moved to closed won, it created a new ticket in our onboarding pipeline. So in this particular example, we're using deals for sales and we're using tickets for onboarding and ongoing CS. And when that deal moved to close won for sales, a new ticket was created in the onboarding pipeline. We copied over the relevant properties. And then we have this workflow, which is actually going to handle the handoff setup itself. So in this workflow, we have when a ticket is ready for onboarding in our onboarding pipeline, we're going to check using one of those required fields that we just set. Is this an enterprise customer? Is this an SMB customer? Depending on what option was selected in sales. And you could also use, products or tier purchased or plan purchased might be a good way to think about that as well. But then depending on which value is selected, we're going to kick off the appropriate next steps. So here we're using HubSpot's format date property or format data property to set the renewal date for a year from today, which again could be based on one of the properties that you might have would be, is this an annual or a monthly plan? And depending on that, you could appropriately set the date down here. We are assigning the record to, depending on whether they're an enterprise or SMB customer, we're using teams within HubSpot to assign this customer to the appropriate team. So in this case, the enterprise onboarding team. And then we are integrating arrows here. Arrows, as I mentioned before, is customer-facing plans that attach to either deals or tickets. So in this case, we are attaching a customer-facing plan using this large firm onboarding template to our newly created ticket. We add the URL to access that plan as a property. Then we are automating sending an email, which we'll get into the third point about templates and snippets. So this is an automated email. You could also create a task to manually send an email, which may be preferable if you have changes that you want to make to the template based on what you know about the customer. If you want to add adding a personal welcome video would be a good reason to not automate that email send, as it gives you that sort of ability to add some context and start building the relationship with the new person. And then finally, create an internal task, which can include all the details about this customer that we need to know for onboarding. So there's lots of different things that you could put in here. Shareil, is there anything that you like to see, that you want to pay particular attention to, do you want your team to pay particular attention to in this handoff? There's either here or sort of that you would add into a handoff workflow. One thing to mention here is that a workflow in HubSpot is just a great way to document the handoff process. You can also come in here and add comments if you wanted, as a way to sort of define what is going to happen, what is the process that we are going to run at each step. And as I mentioned, you can automate pieces of it, but you can also sort of assign manual tasks to your team.
Yeah, there's the two main things that I always want to know and want my teams to know is, what are we responsible for and what's the customer responsible for? And throughout here, you have a number of things that touch on that, which is, am I the physical person, the deal owner of this now, or the record owner? Am I responsible for that onboarding? Who's creating the plan, whether it's automated or manual? Which tier do they fall into? And kind of like we alluded to earlier, some of these copy and paste type of actions are just to make sure that information is moving between teams, which I love. The other thing I'll call out here is you don't necessarily have to start with every single one of these actions. These are all part of handoffs, right? And there's a lot of stuff that I'll even go automate myself and then pull back on because I actually want some human intervention in certain steps. So over time, you can land on the 4 or 5 things you want automated and then making sure that your team has some sense of control. But to me, the key things are I don't want to miss dates in that journey. So if a sales rep has told somebody, by this date, we're doing this task, I want to make sure my team is on top of that. That's where I love the internal HubSpot tasks. Create this when a deal is ready for onboarding. Create this when a customer is stuck on task for X amount of days. Create this when a property is missing. And so any of those moments where in your process you have noticed there is room to cause delay in the process or events that ultimately lead to a customer becoming unsatisfied or churning, those are the parts you want to dig into and ask yourself, do we need some sort of automation to prevent this from happening again? If yes, can a workflow in HubSpot actually solve for that? If no, you can use a workflow to create a manual task to stop in there and then have a human come and look at it, right? And we've done this in the past where we didn't fully know our process yet, and we've just built a task to go check ticket properties. And that's fine. Bring someone in, check those ticket properties, determine which ones need to be automated or not. But the key is making sure that information doesn't go missed between rep to rep to rep, and that your customer on the other side of that doesn't know that me and you are back here trying to figure out who's responsible for what. They should automatically know what's coming up for them. The other thing I really like about this type of setup and workflows is forcing CRM hygiene. Like, how often 6 months into a relationship do we all look at a property inside of a deal or ticket or event or somewhere and there's just information missing? And we get frustrated about it because we need that information to process the renewal or have a conversation or do a follow-up email. So when you run into those frustrations internally, that's a good time to take a step back and look at the bigger process and do some mental mapping and ask yourself, can this be answered a little bit more proactively earlier? Can this be addressed a little bit more proactively earlier? Can this have been avoided a little bit more proactively earlier? And usually that's things like passing along, what are their goals? What other information do they have? What does the activity actually look like? Then you can, as you do this, and kind of what you're getting to here is start to segment customers, which ultimately are those different if-then branches inside of a workflow.
Yeah, I think so this is the other workflow that I mentioned, that is when a deal is moved to close one, create the ticket or the deal or whatever we're going to use in the next phase of the customer journey. And you can see here we're copying over a couple of critical properties that we want. A good way to get started, to Shareil's point, the workflow I just showed sort of has a lot of things in it, right? You could add more things, but you could also do a lot less. One great way to get started with workflows in HubSpot for handoffs is to have this workflow, which says, when this thing happens, when the trigger happens, create the record in the next step, and then just take your existing onboarding steps, your existing, whatever existing documentation you have for what to do in a handoff, copy over the properties that you're going to need, make sure that you have the data that you're going to need in the next step, so copy things over, but then just create a task assign that new customer to somebody and create a task that includes all of your existing documentation. At least then you have everything in one place and you have the data that they're going to need to make decisions on what to do next.
Yeah.
Just having that sort of defined thing that is, we need to do a task, this is the data, and this is the process that we're going to use to make decisions, can be hugely impactful, even if you're not automating the entire handoff itself.
And if you're new to workflows, ultimately they're just an if-then equation. If this event happens, do this next thing. And as you're setting them up, you can also test them and you can review and publish them. So don't fear that they're just going to start turning everything on and automating everything in your process. You can totally go in there and play with them and auto-enroll people into them and get a little bit more familiar with this process. And like I mentioned, don't strive for automating every single step. In fact, do the opposite, I would say. Strive for automating those steps that are the most manual and the most annoying in your process, so that you can then use your human time and your strategic time to focus on customers, but also dig into those other parts of the process and determine, can we automate it? Are there workflows that help? And so on. Can we templatize this and better communicate it?
For sure. Yeah, so very conscious of time here. So we'll fly through.
I was going to say, you have about 15 minutes left. So
yeah. So product data in HubSpot. And maybe I want to cover this really quickly just so that people have context on it. I'll make sure that we include, a much more in-depth walkthrough in the follow-up as well, so we can get some questions. But really quickly, product data in HubSpot is something that isn't talked about or is not a thing that, I think it's not entirely known that this is possible in HubSpot. We see a lot of touting of this functionality if you're looking at CS platforms, but not so much with CRMs. So a few quick things to mention here, some questions to answer. Which product data are you trying to pull into HubSpot, and what are you going to do with it? Sort of ultimately where the decision is going to come down to, because it's definitely possible. There are some great third-party tools out there like HighTouch and Syncari. We'll include some resources to go check those out if you're interested in doing this. So you can do this. You can pull product usage data into HubSpot with pretty minimal engineering time. It's not a go build an integration and then set that up. There are some pretty off-the-shelf ways to pull in that data. But to which product data should you pull into HubSpot specifically for customer success, and then what are you going to do with it? One way that I think about this is that HubSpot is not a product analytics tool, right? Sure, you can make it give you some pretty good product analytics for things like, page views and session times and sort of things that you would expect to put on a dashboard. You can absolutely do that. However, the thing that I think is more powerful from a customer success perspective is picking what are the customer activity metrics that we really care about and are going to use to inform the thing that we do next, right? So what is our value metric, right? If you are an email or an ESP, like an email provider, is it number of sends per account, or is it number of templates added? If you're a project management tool, is it number of projects created, or number of team members, or number of collaborators who have been added? So that's sort of where I would start from a CS perspective, and then pull in, probably no more than 5, say, data points, which you can pull into a custom property on the company record, and then, as you mentioned earlier, move around to the relevant or the associated deals and tickets using a workflow. But that's sort of where I would start, because that's going to let you do much more interesting things than look at a graph, to be blunt about it, I guess. You can then use that data to create your own health scoring. You can use that data to look at the difference between the number of, if you're a usage-based tool, if you have 10 team members included in a particular customer's plan, but they've only they're only have two who've been invited and active on their account, there's a discrepancy there, right? There's an opportunity. Like that's a reason why you might want to have a human reach out and figure out what's going on. If your first moment of value or the goal that you have in onboarding is to get somebody to create, let's say, the first project or the first 3 projects, first project and invite a collaborator, knowing that inside of the CRM where you're managing that process and where your team is actually doing the work to get customers to that outcome can be really impactful. So for this, and just for the purposes of time, like we'll leave it there, but I will provide a much more in-depth like how to set this up in the follow-up. Shareil, maybe what are some questions? I know you've been in the chat. Like what are some things that we should get into specifically at this point?
Yeah, not a ton of questions, more so how do you do some of this stuff?
Yeah.
Versus the why. I think the why is becoming a little bit more clear to folks. I think to me the how to is really starting with one thing. To your point of even product data, there's so many product data points that we try to bring in, but we don't really know what we're doing with all that data, so don't overwhelm your systems or yourself even. A tangible example is I see this all the time. People will bring in product data for exported reports, for example, in their analytics suite. But nowhere in their onboarding or sales process are they actually encouraging people to go export reports. And that's not to say that's not an important metric. It just might not be important for this part of the life cycle. So make sure that those workflows, those automations, those reports you're building, the data you're bringing in, whether it's from third-party tools or your own product, also is in line for where those customers are in that part of their life cycle. And obviously the earlier on they are, you're still trying to teach them how to do things and trying to ingrain into their brain why they should be doing those things over and over and over again. So what are those 2 or 3 value realization moments that your customers are bringing up? These are their needs and their goals. Sure, you can have your own. Sure, you can have adoption metrics that you're trying to hit and you want your product used and every feature used and every pillar used. But that's not what you're trying to solve for in those early days. So what are the customer's goals? Can you teach them those things, whether that's through human-led onboarding, through marketing, through all of those other pieces? And then can you actually measure the output inside of ultimately your product, but then bring that data back in so that you can have kind of that validation flywheel, if you will, of here's what they said they want to do. We showed them how to go do that thing, and now they are physically doing that thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like connecting the data that you're pulling in with the thing that you're going to do with it is sort of the key, and then being able to report on that on the other side, which is really the value of having it all in one place, right? Do you have what is happening with what we're doing to try to change what is happening with what is the impact of that intervention that we're having?
Yeah. Phil's asking a great question. Do you use deals or ticket pipelines to manage CS? I've used a combination of both. Right now I'm using kind of deals for the early stages because we're kind of working between pre-sales and sales and then onboarding in one pipeline, if you will, or in one motion. So in there I'm using deals. I also like tying that same monetary amount to the deal. But then I'm also using, and it depends on the customer type, I'm also using tickets for folks that are a little bit more self-serve and that we're not as engaged in pre-sales with during my portion of the world. So maybe a roundabout answer, but it kind of depends on which ones you have paid for, obviously, which ones you have access to. I like tickets in the sense that you can also associate a ticket to a deal. So you could have one sales deal and then have multiple events. I think the key is whichever one you're using, my personal opinion is try to have a deal or ticket for as many of those moments in that life cycle as you can, because that ultimately is your timestamp data over time. And then you ask Phil you mentioned that you're a service company, so you don't have product data to track necessarily. That's totally fine. Yes, you can have AMs do it. You can use internal project management systems to feed that data in. Wherever you're capturing that yes, no. Here's the thing we said. Are customers doing that thing? Yes or no? Great. That, even if that's as simple as a checkbox inside of a property on a deal or on a ticket, to give you some insight or some directional information as to we are driving these customers towards doing that. Because what you're ultimately looking for is some sort of aggregate data that you can draw patterns out of. So if you had 100 customers onboarded to your service this last year and you talked to 80 of them, are those 80 doing that one or two things that they told you they want to do? Especially if it's very unique to them in your case, if it's not truly a product where you can have those individual data points, I think it's even more important to make sure you're having those conversations, manually tracking it. That's when it can become overwhelming, obviously. What do we track? Where do we track it? How much of it do we track? Start simple there. Have a line in the sand that you're trying to reach, and then ask yourself, are the things we're saying or the content we're putting out or the resources we're doing or the workshops we're publishing driving customers to that piece?
Yeah, I think having a defined, we talk about this a lot with onboarding, it's like, what does and you can apply it to any other stage in the customer journey, is what does onboarded or what does success look like for this stage of the journey, and put a number on it, have a definition, and then build the process. Make sure that you're continuing to do discovery with customers to make sure that definition is actually correct, right? Like, what you don't want to happen is optimize a process that ultimately isn't moving the business needle in the way that you want it to. But having something defined means that you can measure and optimize how you're getting customers there.
Yeah.
So just even if you don't know, right, what good looks like, let's say that for us, like, number of active plans created is sort of a metric that we think about, right? Like, how many, as a customer of Arrow's, how many plans have you created? How many of those plans, like, just creating them isn't really value in itself. Like, it's sort of it's a step on the road to realizing value, but ultimately you need to have participants, you need to have things happening in those plans for you to be successful. Yeah. And so sort of picking that as a North Star means that you can orient yourself and your process around that.
Yeah. Another great question from Jeremy, and this is one I feel your pain on a lot. This has been kind of my own problem in life, and trying to convince leaders and where the budget is. Yes, exactly. All the feels. But how do you, if HubSpot or sales is using Salesforce, marketing is using HubSpot, no one's willing to budge on tools or process, like, how do you prove, or how do you get CS to prove the value to use HubSpot or to get some sort of budget on either of these products? One, I think, let's even come out of Salesforce or HubSpot for a second. Like, if you do a good job of documenting all of the information that's being translated in these processes, it will quickly become overwhelming and unmanageable, because you're going to have a Google Sheet per person or a Google Doc per person, and how do you share all that? And then there's no visibility behind that, and there's no reporting behind that, right? So I think the quickest path to go down is probably what you're already doing, which is painfully and manual, and it's driving you insane. And then being able to share that information with at least your direct leadership, and tying that to, I've done this in spreadsheets plenty of times, where here are the 10 customers, here's what we talked about, some notes, here's next steps. Nobody on your team wants to read that. No one has visibility into that. And so almost taking your own pains and trying to make others internally feel some of those pains as well, I think is a good point to get started on that conversation. And that's not to, like, point fingers or create separation internally. It's actually to encourage the fact that this information is important and we are collecting it in CS. We don't know where to put it because we don't have access in either of these products or tools. The other thing that often happens is customers are going to churn no matter what. Those that do churn, if you can unpack what happened there and share some of that timeline and share some of those notes, because that might be the way to convey to others that we were actually tracking this inside of this spreadsheet or inside of this Google Doc, and we had a little bit of insight that this customer was going to churn, but I had nowhere to document that or track that. Second to that, if you actually have a seat in either of these products, there is an activities or an events tab that you have access to regardless of which hub you're on or which tier you're on. So try to overwhelm, and I keep saying overwhelm, but try to do that intentionally and overwhelm that activities tab. And if you can sync your email directly to it, great, because now all those communications are pumping into that activity tab. But what I'm trying to get to is what you want to be able to do is show that there is actually a lot of engagement and interaction that happens with customers beyond that point of marketing and point of sale. And we need to capture that information somewhere. Either way, we have to do it, whether you give us seats or budget or not. We're doing it today inside of Docs or inside of Google Sheets or just through email, and it's populating inside of this main activity tab on the company record. It would work a lot better if we had our own section for it or if we had our own place for it. I've seen this happen too, where teams still say, nope, just use the sales deal. We already are paying for sales or HubSpot sales, and we want to use sales deals in there. Use the same deal. Great. That will become too much. Like, if you're taking the right notes, if you're asking the right questions, if you're following up with customers and actually tracking that life cycle, like, you likely care about renewals, you likely care about expansion revenue, you likely care about those new users. All of those are life cycle moments that you want a timestamp for so that you can actually dissect that customer journey and be able to take a step back and say, oh, here is what we're able to fix and why. If no one on your team actually cares about fixing the process or digging deeper into it or optimizing it or scaling it, yes, this is going to be an uphill battle because you're not going to get budget to do those things. But I would find it hard to believe most sales or success leaders don't care about those things. And the only way that I have found to be able to prove why I should have a seat at the table, why I should get budget, why I should get any sort of conversation around the topic of customer success is when I've been able to point back to a report in a dashboard or a report inside of HubSpot or share that information. It's not impossible outside of that. You can totally do it. Question is, how much time will you be spending doing it? How frustrated are your teams doing that? How much effort and energy is actually being used to put towards that, which all ultimately equates to energy and effort not put towards making customers successful and happy and using the product. So it's a little bit passive aggressive, but kind of what you want to do is be able to prove and say, we are doing all this work. We have nowhere to put it and nowhere to actually capture this information. We want to because we think it's valuable and it can improve sales this way and it can improve marketing this way and it can reduce potential upstream support tickets that we're seeing today, and we can combat those things. We just have no place to capture that information.
Yeah, I think showing being able to show the impact of continuing in the current path is important. But there we go. We're at time. I know this was maybe a little less tactical than folks were looking for. We'll make sure that there was plenty of tactical stuff in the follow-up. We will be doing this again in probably a month's time. In a couple of weeks, we will have a more specific session on designing and optimizing onboarding plans. We'll include details of that in the follow-up as well. But thank you so much to everybody who took the time to join us. Hopefully there was something here that you took away. If you have any questions, just let us know. We're Stuart at arrows.to or Shareil at arrows.to. But we're always happy to help and dive into anything specific that you have. But Shareil, thanks so much for being here as well.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks all for joining.